The global energy shift is officially on, and it's driving demand for critical minerals like copper. On today's episode of Shifting Energy, we will examine the copper market, tell you about ETFs tracking it, and the underlying factors that have turned copper into a high-demand commodity. Stay with us for that. I'm Thalia Hayden with ETF Guide. It's great to have you with us. Welcome to Shifting Energy, an original episode series that keeps you on top of big changes in the global energy transition. Today's focus is copper. It's element number 29 on the periodic table of elements. Copper has been a critical mineral for thousands of years. In ancient civilizations, everyday items like water vessels, harvesting tools, and razors were made of copper. Today, copper plays an equally important role in our society. As a semi-precious, malleable metal, copper is used for electricity, electronics, building construction, consumer healthcare products, and transportation. But there's more to this story. Thanks to the global quest for net zero carbon emissions, copper has been pushed into the spotlight. So what's copper's present and future role in the global energy transition? And how can you position your investment portfolio to participate? Here to discuss that and more is Steve Schoffstall, Director of ETF Product Management, and Ed Coyne, Senior Managing Partner of Global Sales for Sprott Asset Management. Great to have you both with us. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Sure. Let's get started right now. From ancient times to now, copper has been a crucial mineral to society. Today, copper is playing a huge role in the now underway energy shift toward a carbon-free world. Ed, can you tell us more about copper's role in the energy shift and why decarbonization can't happen without copper?
Sure. It really goes back to critical materials in general being really a growth story. When you think about copper, its role in electricity is unchanged, but the sheer volume of copper that's needed today relative to just a few years ago, whether it's electric vehicles, battery storage, movement of where energy is created to where energy is consumed, you simply just need more of it. And so that's going to continue as we look for other ways to energize the global economy, not to mention the technology aspect of it, but just more people coming on the electric grid. Globally, around the world, more people are gaining access to electricity. More copper is going to be needed for that. So nothing's changing in the core technology of it, but the sheer demand of it is increasing rapidly.
Got it. Next, let's talk about the forces driving copper demand and why it's a megatrend that investors should pay attention to. Steve, you want to take this one?
Absolutely. So EVs are a spot of the energy transition that we really can't underestimate. When we look at just how many were sold last year, we're somewhere around 14 million EVs that hit the market last year. That's significant growth that we're seeing. If we just go back just 3 short years ago, the growth between then and now is about fourfold. So very much accelerating in the usage of EVs. And why that's important as it relates to copper is when you start to think about these newer technologies, they tend to be much more electrified. So if you look at an internal combustion engine, so your typical gas-powered car relative to a typical EV, you're going to need about 2.4 times the copper in an EV as you would in that gas-powered car. And then when we start to look at the entire infrastructure that's needed to support the EVs, it's not just related to the vehicle itself. When we start to think about charging stations, for example, they can require anywhere from 1.5 to about 17.5 pounds of copper, depending on the type of charger that's being used. And this is also an area where we're starting to see increased investment as well. When we look at the overall global investment in the energy transition, last year it was just south of $1.8 trillion on a global scale. About 630 billion of that was related to electrified transportation. So think EVs and building out the infrastructure for that. So they're definitely really contributing to the growth sector that we're seeing as it relates to not only copper, but also the energy transition in general.
That certainly makes sense. Well, electricity demand is expected to climb 86% by 2050. That's according to the IEA World Energy Outlook. And global electricity demand will put tremendous stress on electric grids everywhere. In fact, many of these grids will need massive upgrades. So what role will copper play in this mega trend, Steve?
So this is actually a part of the overall copper story that normally gets overlooked. A lot focuses on EVs and the energy transition, But as you stated, there's an expected increase of electricity demand of about 86%. A lot of that comes from Western nations as we get more technologically advanced and get much more integrated with our technology, whether it's EVs or other electric applications, the increased usage of smartphones. And what we see on many of the developing countries is we're starting to see a rising middle class, and that in and of itself is actually requiring much more electricity. The great thing about copper is it's not only is it the second best conductor of electricity next to silver, but when you compare the two metals, it is much more cost effective to use copper. That's why when we see any place where we have to move electrical currents, we typically see copper being used over silver. And this whole process of generating cleaner energy actually does take a lot more copper than what we see with traditional fossil fuel powered plants. So if we were to look at something like solar power or wind power, that's going to use about 2.5 times the copper that we see from a coal-fired plant or a natural gas plant. If we start looking at offshore wind farms, that actually goes up to about 7 times. So as we're having this increased demand from the energy transition, we also have this increased demand just from the way that the demographics of the population is changing.
Great information. Now, shifting gears a little bit beyond the adoption of EVs and the coming wave of electric grid upgrades, are there other notable growth trends that are driving copper usage and demand?
A lot of what we see is from the energy transition. And one of the reasons that we focus on copper is because we see a lot of that growth coming from the energy transition. One thing that is very important for investors to know is the supply side of the equation. So we're actually running at a small supply deficit now for copper, but we expect that to increase as we progress through this energy transition, as our electric needs increase considerably as we go through the next several decades. And just to put that in some context, if you look at all of human history, we've mined somewhere around 700 million tons of copper. So a significant amount of copper has come out of the ground. Some estimates say that by the time we get to 2050, we're going to have to mine about twice that. So an additional 1.4 billion pounds. So the issue that we have is, one, we have to find new supplies of copper because we're in a situation where a lot of the copper that's been mined has actually the easy copper has been taken. So if you look at about 150 years ago, we have to move much more of the material just to get the copper out of the ground that we were. We also have to go to more remote parts of the world to find plentiful mining resources and copper resources. That's also been a challenge, as a lot of these places don't have infrastructure in place. And once we do discover a new resource, to get that resource up and producing in a meaningful way, you're typically looking at about 16 years. So it's a very long process to get from the finding of a new mine, to go through the permitting and then the construction part of the process. So a lot of work has to be done on the supply side if we're going to keep up with demand.
Wow, very insightful there. Thanks so much, Steve. And Ed, this one's for you. The Sprott Copper Miners ETF and the Sprott Junior Copper Miners ETF are ways to participate in copper's growth story. So how do these copper ETFs work and what do they own?
Sure. So we co-created an index with NASDAQ to really track the performance of copper equities. When you look at what's going on in the overall copper market, whether you're talking about large cap, senior copper mining companies, or the more opportunistic small cap or junior copper mining companies, with this index creation, we're looking to give investors exposure to the copper space through the underlying mining stocks or equities. So through that, we're giving clients the exposure on the senior side, where you're seeing these companies that are developed. They have a long track record, a long history. They have diversification as relates to where their mines are located. And then for those that are looking for more of an opportunistic approach to the space, we give exposure to the juniors, which in some cases are late stage discovery, early stage development. They have potentially in some cases a longer runway, and they also have the option to be acquired potentially over time as some of the senior mining companies out there are looking to replace some of the reserves. So we think there's unique ways to think about the copper space through the underlying equities. For those that aren't familiar with mining in general, if you think about the large cap senior mining ETF, COPP, that would be similar to what you'd expect in like S&P type indexes. Not the same market cap, but typically above 10 billion in market cap. But as far as how investors think about investing in this index, The senior would be more large cap, would be more akin to the S&P 500 as far as how that would look and feel. On the junior side, that would be more small cap in nature. So for investors who are typically comfortable with investing in the traditional equity markets, that would be more akin to like the Russell 2000. So smaller, more regional type of companies. So very similar when we talk about senior versus junior as it relates to the mining stocks. And both these ETFs out there, COPJ would be the junior one. Both these ETFs out there are really giving investors exposure in a pure play fashion. So we're not investing in the overall ecosystem of the copper space, trucking companies and industry companies and so forth. We're really looking at the underlying mining stocks themselves to give you direct access and give you direct allocation to the copper market, which I think is important because so often investors will say, well, I own a general commodity fund. I'm getting exposure to the general markets. Well, if you believe from an investment thesis standpoint that copper, like we do, is going to continue to expand from a supply-demand standpoint, which we think should increase price discovery, you're really not going to capture that in an overall commodity fund. You need a very specific pure play type of allocation. And we think at Sprott, we deliver that both on the senior COPP and the junior COPJ.
All right. And one final question before we wrap up. This one's going to go to both of you. We'll start with Ed. How do you see an ETF like COPP being deployed by financial advisors and investors inside a diversified portfolio?
Sure. When you look at the return patterns, and I think that's something we always talked about, Sprott has a long history of being a precious metals firm as well. When you talk about what we do in the gold market or the silver market, it's the same thing. You're looking for diversity in your return patterns, things that move at different times. And one of the things I think that's unique about copper right now is historically copper has been a bellwether when you think about it from a performance pattern of the strength or weakness of an economy. Well, today, everyone's focused on China, saying China's slowing. That's why copper has sold off a little bit, although more recently it's doing well again. We see this opportunity very unique in that regardless if the economies are slowing or not, there's so much capital being invested in the infrastructure of alternative energy, clean energy, trying to get to this carbon neutral footprint that we think copper is going to continue to look very attractive out there, potentially over time. So this gives you real diversity within your portfolio, just not above and beyond what's going on from the global economy, but really what's happening and how capital is being deployed in this movement. So we think for investors that are looking to get some diversity in their portfolio, to get an asset or two in their portfolio that has a different performance pattern than the core of their portfolio, we think right now both the senior COPP and the junior COPJ are a really interesting way to A, participate in the movement, but also B, diversify their portfolio and get a different performance pattern than maybe the core of their portfolio.
And Steve, your insight here?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Ed. And just to highlight, copper's often been given the name Dr. Copper because it is a barometer for the global economy. And just to really highlight something Ed said and something we spoke about here is when we see this increased investment in the energy transition, a lot of that comes from China. A lot of it's working its way now through the European Union and the United States, where we're starting to see increasing amounts of investment. But what we see from China in particular is that copper's remained a very good gauge of global economic growth, but we're starting to see decoupling there. And some of that comes around because we're seeing China make these investments in the energy transition. It's really helping to support copper prices. And so in our view, copper is one of those critical minerals that we think can add a degree of diversification to a portfolio, or alternatively could be used as a growth asset allocator within a portfolio as well.
We could talk about this much longer, but unfortunately we need to leave things here. Thank you so much, Steve and Ed, for your copper insights. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for today's episode of Shifting Energy. If you enjoyed the show, tell us in the comments section below by hitting that like button. To learn more about the investment strategies and ETFs we discuss on today's program, be sure to visit SprottETFs.com. I'm Thalia Hayden with ETF Guide. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.